Hello? Yep, it works. Now, you said there was going to be some kind of video thing too? Go ahead.
All right, everybody. I'd like to welcome you all to our last talk of the Reflections Projections Conference for the year. I just want to take 1 second. Can we give all the people in the maroon shirts, why don't we give them a round of applause? They're the ones who worked hard to put this through this weekend. So my name's Chris, and I'm the president of the Cryptography and Communications Club along with ACM. And today we're bringing out Fil Cimmermann. He doesn't really need too much of an introduction, so here he is.
Well, it so happens that I'm actually giving 2 talks on campus. I'm giving a talk tomorrow, and that's going to be about the political side of cryptography, the implications for civil liberties and other non-crypto civil liberties issues about surveillance technologies and the Patriot Act. So I have to stay away from the political side today so that both venues get their full value. So today, the guys that invited me here had originally said that they wanted me to talk about the technical aspects of PGP and crypto and PGP war stories. But after my arrival here, I began to see that unlike a lot of conferences with IT managers who want to learn more about public key infrastructures, this audience is so heavily it's an engineering audience, and that being also an engineering audience from a very good engineering school, that trying to teach you anything about about the technical aspects of public key cryptography would be like bringing coals to Newcastle. So I think that I'll probably have to de-emphasize that part of it unless you want me to talk about technical aspects of it, which will come out in the questions, and switch a little more emphasis toward the history of the PGP saga and the war stories that went on. And I even decided to tell a war story that I don't recall telling in a public venue before. Fortunately, the statute of limitations has run out, which is the only reason why I can tell this. Well, let me start with my original motivation for writing PGP was back in the 1980s. I was active in the peace movement and the nuclear weapons freeze campaign, and I could see that grassroots political organizations and human rights groups would need ways of protecting themselves from their own hostile governments. And during the 1980s, we had just such a hostile government. And so that's when I started working on the early designs for PGP in 1984. As a matter of fact, that's when I first started writing some code that would later become part of PGP. That was actually part of the random number generator, the collection of entropy from keystroke timings. These days it isn't in the code anymore, since there's been kind of a turnover in the code. But that was the original motivation. And in fact, during the 3-year criminal investigation that happened from 93 to 96, my defense lawyers wouldn't let me tell people that it was really a human rights project, because that would be tantamount to admitting that I wanted it to be exported, since most of the human rights problems were overseas. And a crucial part of the prosecutor's strategy, the prosecution, the theory of prosecution, was that they had to prove intent to export, and so I could only talk about the usefulness of PGP in domestic civil liberties problems here in the U.S. But that's one minor thing that I can now say after the statute of limitations has run out. But I'll get to the major thing later when for what I can what was legally problematic. So when I published PGP, I didn't really realize what kind of a feeding frenzy it would set off. I thought that I could just put it out there, sort of like PK Zip, and just let it out there, and people could have a good time with it, and I could turn my attention back to my consulting work, which had been long neglected because of my spending all my time on PGP. And in fact, I'd missed 5 consecutive mortgage payments on my house, and I really honed my negotiation skills with banks. So it was really time to turn my attention back to making money. But I discovered that there was such a feeding frenzy from putting PGP out there that it was nagging me to trying to get my attention back again. And it really pissed off Jim Bidzos, the president of RSA, because it used the RSA public key algorithm, which at that time was patented. That patent expired in the year 2000, but it was very much in effect in the early 1990s, in 91 when I first came out with this. And I went to the IACR crypto conference, International Association for Cryptological Research, and I met Adi Shamir, the S in RSA, and Ellie Beam, his doctoral student, who were working on new techniques of cryptanalysis called differential cryptanalysis. And I asked them to evaluate the block cipher that I had designed myself for PGP. At that time, I was still laboring under the misconception that I could design a block cipher. And so Adi Shamir said, sure, send it to me in Israel, and I'll spend 10 minutes looking at it and tell you what I think. Well, in retrospect, that was before the criminal investigation had begun. I am so glad that I didn't take him up on that offer. However, his doctoral student, Ellie Beam, who was not quite as famous as Adi Shamir, nowhere near at that time, although now he's become famous because of his outstanding work as a cryptanalyst with differential cryptanalysis, and he was also a lead designer and one of the candidates for the advanced encryption standard. But at that time, he wasn't quite as famous, and so he was more accessible. So he agreed to look at it in depth over lunch. That means in depth, right? More than the 10 minutes. So we went to the lunchroom, and he looked at it, and within 10 minutes, he found some embarrassing weaknesses in it. And my block cipher was called the Bassomatic, and named after a Saturday Night Live skit involving a fish in a blender. Sort of my metaphor of encrypting things. Anyway, so it was at that moment that I realized that after I had already released PGP 1.0, if Ellie Beam could find these embarrassing weaknesses in the block cipher that I developed myself in just such a short time, that this finally made it clear to me that it was utterly hopeless for me to design a block cipher of my own. So fortunately, at the same conference, I became aware of a new block cipher called IDEA, which was a very good block cipher that had been developed in Switzerland by Xu Zhilai. And it has stood the test of time over many years of people trying to break it, and it already had been subject to a great deal of peer review by cryptanalysts. So I decided to make that become part of the next version of PGP and abandon the Bassomatic. Well, anyway, Over the next 15 months, from PGP 1.0, which came out in June of 91, to PGP 2.0 in September 92, we worked on PGP 2.0, but I used volunteers from all over the world that had come forth and offered to translate it to other platforms. It initially ran on just MS-DOS, but they were going to port it to all the Unix platforms. And I think we pretty much got every Unix platform at that time. And also translated into a number of foreign languages. I developed a scheme where we put all the foreign language phrases in a ASCII text file. Not ASCII, whatever foreign language text file. And at runtime, you could switch foreign languages by specifying something in the configuration file. Anyway, that made it possible for it to be used by a lot of people in Europe. And so PGP 2.0 finally came out, and it was truly an international product. It had been worked on by a lot of people all over the world. And I remember my phone bill at that time, just for 1 month, was like $800, because I was talking to people all over the world, having engineering discussions with, trying to get all the features put in and getting the debugging going, and we were emailing back and forth source code and so on. So now it so happens that at that time, because I was doing this sort of active development work with people all over the world, I was in violation of the Arms Export Control Act. And unlike the initial publication of PGP, which scattered around the world on the internet in a kind of a random way, this was a deliberate, focused effort on my part to develop a product using engineers from all over the world and moving giant blocks of cryptographic source code back and forth across the U.S. border. And so it was clear later, after the criminal investigation began, that my greatest vulnerability was in the development of PGP 2.0. However, when the criminal investigation did begin, which was after PGP 2.0 came out, their focus mainly focused on the events of June 1991 with the initial publication of PGP. Now, the reason why they began this investigation is because Jim Bidzos, the president of RSA and Public Key Partners, contacted U.S. Customs and the U.S. Attorney's Office in San Jose and asked them to prosecute me. And so it was, in fact, from his point of view, he wanted to squash PGP because it used the RSA patented algorithm, and it screwed up the revenue model that they had for that patent. See, the revenue model that they had was, there was at that time a standard called Privacy Enhanced Mail, or PEM. And Privacy Enhanced Mail was going to have a license to use the RSA algorithm, the RSA patent, with the condition that everyone who generates a key get their key certified by RSA. And everyone would have to pay like $25, and they'd have to renew it every 2 years to do that. So this was going to produce a huge amount of revenue for RSA. But PGP, the PGP trust model, especially with version 2 that came out, allowed anyone to sign anyone else's key, and it was a kind of a decentralized grassroots trust model. And so it completely disrupted the trust model that PEM relied on, which is, in fact, what the RSA revenue model relied on. So, so that's what really upset Jim Bidzos, and so he attempted to have me put in prison. You know, I asked one of his employees later, why didn't they simply sue me? And he said, well, it doesn't pay to sue folk heroes. So from a business perspective, it wasn't good for their business to sue a folk hero, so it's better to get the feds to try to actually put me in prison than it was to sue me. Personally, I would rather have been sued. Maybe if I were 6'4" and very muscular, I could have, you know, handled myself in prison a little better, you know, but So I got a call in February '93 from Special Agent Robin Sturzer of U.S. Customs in San Jose, who asked me to explain some things about PGP. What is it? How does it work? What can I tell her about it? And so I figured, well, U.S. Customs agents must have come across PGP in one of their investigations. Perhaps they seized a computer that was using it. They needed some help explaining to them how it works, so I was happy to answer any questions on the phone. And then she said, well, we'd like to come out and have a chat with you about it. Well, I lived in Boulder, Colorado at the time, and that's a long way from San Jose. So I said, okay. That's when I began to realize that there was something about their interest, that they weren't just trying to learn about PGP. So I went and hired myself a criminal defense lawyer, Phil Dubois, who was not a specialist in export control laws, but in fact was a criminal lawyer who defended criminals. And the first time I went into his office, I saw a box on the floor that it said Michael Bell's discovery documents. And Michael Bell was a notorious killer, murderer in Boulder at that time. And I thought, my God, what am I doing here? I'm in the office of a guy who defends criminals. You know, what? That's not me. Why am I here? And so it turned out that that was a really good choice because, you know, Phil Dubois had a lot of experience, federal experience, a lot of drug experience, which is a real good way to toughen up and make a criminal defense attorney real streetwise and scrappy. He worked in the public defender's office, so he could do it with limited resources. I didn't have much money. I was still recovering from the 5 missed mortgage payments, you know. So I had to scrape together some cash to give him to get him started, but then we set up a legal defense fund, and people started donating money, which carried us all the way through the 3-year criminal investigation. Anyway, it turned out that other attorneys volunteered to be on the legal defense team. Another guy was Eben Moglin, who was a Columbia Law School professor who had clerked for, I believe, Thurgood Marshall, who also wrote an APL interpreter before he became a lawyer. Is APL still in use today? You guys would know, right? No? It's not. Okay, but you've heard of it, right? Anyway. Another guy was Ken Bass, who was from a major Washington law firm who had worked in the Justice Department in the Carter administration on national security issues. Another guy was Kurt Karnow, an intellectual property lawyer in San Francisco, who, since we thought that there would be intellectual property elements to the case, we thought would be a good choice. And also he was a former federal prosecutor. His father is Stanley Karnow, who wrote Vietnam, A History, and also put together the PBS documentary Vietnam, A Television History, which I've seen and I'd recommend to anybody who wants to learn about Vietnam. So he had the good progressive credentials. And so we had this sort of gang of 4, and then we had other lawyers sort of waiting in line to help, you know. So just take a number and get in line, you know. Anyway, I went to Washington in October of '93 to testify in front of a House subcommittee on export controls on cryptography, and while I was there, we met with. That was right after the criminal investigation, where I was officially notified of the criminal investigation that I was a target of it, and so we had a meeting at the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And EFF had put together this meeting of I think there was 10 lawyers in the room. There was my lawyer, Phil Dubois, who came with me. There was an ACLU lawyer, EFF, a couple of lawyers from EFF. I think it was Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility had a lawyer there. And I can't remember, and maybe from a Washington law firm. And so there were 10 lawyers in the room, and we closed the door, and only lawyers were in the room, so it was all attorney-client privileged, and they asked me to explain the situation. So Phil Dubois said a few words to give him a legal context of things, and I explained what I had done. And I explained what I had done in developing PGP 2.0, which was what I regarded as the most egregious vulnerability I had legally. And they all listened to this. And when I finished explaining it, they all sort of looked at each other and shook their heads and said that I had no chance, that I would certainly lose, that I was going to prison, and that, that was it. It was hopeless. Well, Phil Dubois didn't feel that way because he was the only criminal lawyer in the room. Everyone else was, sort of a lawyer that had other specialties, And so he's a criminal trial lawyer. I mean, his world is in the courtroom defending criminals, or the wrongfully accused, So he had a lot more confidence in it than they did. But that was the worst day of the 3-year criminal investigation, to have 10 lawyers all tell me, almost unanimously, with the slight waffling of my own lead defense counsel, that it was hopeless. That was a ton of bricks. That was the worst day. Fortunately, that meeting took place right after my House subcommittee hearing. If it had taken place before my House subcommittee hearing, it would have been a very badly presented House subcommittee testimony. What I learned after that was that really there's a lot about the process of criminal law, criminal defense, that I just didn't know before. It's not as cut and dried as all those lawyers said. There's it's sort of like a layered defense. I used to be a sort of a military policy analyst in the 1980s, so I like to draw metaphors to military policy issues. And it's like Star Wars, the ballistic missile defense. You have elements of the defense that work during the boost phase of the missiles as they're rising from their missile silos in the Soviet Union. You have space lasers that try to hit them while they're still on their launch vehicles with their giant fuel tanks and huge infrared signatures that make them attractive, easily detected targets. And then you have another set of weapons that work in the mid-course phase when you have the threat cloud blossoming out from the launch vehicles and with the decoys and everything else. And it's all very specialized because of that. And then you have the reentry phase and the terminal phase, where in the last frantic seconds before impact, you're trying to, where the decoys have been blown away by reentry, you're trying to hit the reentry vehicles. And each of these things requires different weapon systems to hit them. And so the same thing happens with a criminal defense. First you have the boost phase, where you're trying to get them to not indict you. Or maybe it's before they even launch. You're politically posturing and trying to persuade them not to launch or something. And then you have, if you do get indicted, then you're preparing for trial and negotiating with them on whatever you can. Although I wasn't willing to negotiate very much on the principles. And then you have things that happen at trial that involve the special abilities of a criminal trial lawyer like Phil Dubois. And then you finally have, in the last phase, you have jury nullification. And that's where, no matter how good a job you did on the legal aspects of the case, the jury can still rule in your favor because they think the law is immoral. And that was something we were certainly going to try for. So we had this kind of all scoped out. And part of the early phase was to talk to the press. I wanted to talk to the press. My political instincts told me that it would be a good idea to talk to the press. And my legal defense team all told me that I should not talk to the press because criminal lawyers don't like their clients to talk to the press. Generally, it's, you hardly ever see it. In fact, lawyers often quit because their clients talk to the press. But I managed to convince my legal defense team that it was a good idea to talk to the press. So I did almost every day, probably about 5 times a week for the entire 3 years. And it was a good idea because in the jury of public opinion, in the court of public opinion, I was doing pretty well. So, in fact, during the same time, there were a lot of articles being written about a kind of an esoteric subject, and that was the whole subject of U.S. export controls on cryptography and domestic controls, because at that time the FBI was putting forth the idea of the Clipper chip, which was an encryption device that the Clinton administration had put forth, which actually had been developed under the previous administration. I don't know how long it had been under development, but it came out at in the first month of the Clinton administration, or I think in April of, the first 3 months of the Clinton administration, which was the idea of a chip that would that would encrypt phone calls, and this chip would have embedded in it a unique key that was different for each chip, and the key would be kept in a vast government database. The government would have an exclusive monopoly to manufacture these chips, and the database would be used for wiretap purposes. And for some reason, much to the surprise of the U.S. government, the Clipper chip did not go over well politically. For some reason, the American public didn't like the idea of putting these chips into all the telephones with Big Brother inside. And so journalists liked to write articles about it, and every time they wrote an article about it, they would have a sidebar about my case, the human face of this policy. Well, the human face of the consequences of this policy. So anyway, so I got really used to talking to the press. And during the entire 3 years, every last article was sympathetic to me and critical of the government. Not just 99% of them, 100%, 100.0%. That's amazing. Probably it would have gone differently if it was after 9/11. But anyway, finally, the government dropped the case 3 years later. But during that time, there were some rather harrowing incidents that happened. One of them was, there were several key people around the world that worked on PGP. And remember, I was always thinking that the real vulnerability that I had was the subsequent development of PGP 2.0, which came out 15 months after the initial version of PGP. But I didn't know until really the end of the case that the prosecutor had focused the whole time on the events of June of 1991 with the initial publication of PGP. If I'd known that, I would have realized much earlier that I was going to win. In fact, it was because they had some real evidentiary problems that they dropped the case. They dropped it because of evidentiary problems, because of First Amendment problems, and because also, I think, and they wouldn't admit this, but I sort of infer that it was politically difficult to proceed with the case. They dropped it in 1996, which was an election year, and the entire U.S. computer industry was against the administration on this one issue of export controls on cryptography. And so to try to prosecute me in that election year on something that the most powerful, richest industry in the U.S. that was responsible more than any other industry for the economic prosperity of the United States in the 1990s was unanimously against prosecuting me. So I think that had some impact on their decision to drop the case. But during the time where they were putting together their case in the early days, they wanted to send a customs agent to go and interview a guy named Peter Gutman in Auckland, New Zealand. Now, Peter Gutman is a cryptographer who now has published a number of papers and has made a name for himself in cryptography. But at that time, he was one of the early volunteers who helped me translate PGP into other Unix platforms and worked on mostly porting PGP. And so I used to send source code to Peter Gutmann and send it back and forth. And there was another guy in California named Hal Finney, who was an American within a U.S. jurisdiction, within easy reach of the prosecutor. And I sort of kept Hal's name out of a lot of things. I sort of never mentioned him in public because I was afraid of drawing attention to him, to the prosecutor. Because Hal had a lot to protect. He had a wife and kids and a mortgage and, you know, a nice middle-class lifestyle. He was a sitting duck for a prosecutor who could come in and put pressure on him to turn him in a case against me. I mean, Hal was a good friend, but I certainly didn't expect him to withstand the incredible pressure that a prosecutor can bring in a criminal investigation. And again, I was mostly fearing the development of PGP 2.0. And so when they wanted to go and talk to Peter Gutmann, I was scared to death because Peter Gutmann couldn't understand why this was a problem, you know. I mean, he was a graduate student, and he was so, and he said, well, I can't see why I can't just tell him the truth, that you didn't export PGP, you know, that I got it myself from an FTP site in the U.S. And really, and I couldn't talk to Peter Gutmann because my criminal lawyer, Phil Dubois, would not allow me to talk to Peter Gutmann about this because that would be obstruction of justice. And this is the part where I haven't really talked about this in public before. And so I couldn't talk to Peter Gutmann, which was driving me crazy. Because I knew that if experienced criminal investigators sat down in front of Peter Gutmann and started questioning him, that he would just be putty in their hands. Because he wouldn't understand the danger, you know. I mean, he's only looking at it from the point of view of New Zealand law. And he was in no danger. So I was racking my brain, I told him he should get himself a lawyer. So his lawyer could advise him. Certainly his own lawyer would tell him why there was a problem, right? No, he went and got a lawyer, a business lawyer. Boy, I tell you, during this case, I really got familiar with the differences between different lawyers and different specialties. You know, don't go to a lawyer about a lawyer specializing in family law to give you advice on how to deal with criminal prosecutors, you know, or business law or something like that. So Peter Gutmann, he went to some lawyer friend of his, and the lawyer said, don't worry, you have nothing to worry about. Go ahead and talk to him. And so I was going crazy. Now, at this time, I had a friend visiting me, a guy named Colin Plum from Canada, who had been helping me with PGP code development, which kind of slowed to a stop here because I couldn't work with anybody outside the U.S. anymore. That's where most of the labor was. But Colin, as it turned out, had been engaged in daily email dialogue with Peter Gutmann about a completely unrelated technical issue. It had to do with a project that Peter Gutmann himself was working on that involved disk encryption, where you have an I.O. driver that encrypts disk writes and decrypts disk reads on the fly. It's a very interesting project. In fact, a lot of the ideas that he came up with, we later developed into PGP disk. And so Colin and I had worked out strategies for doing disk encryption in my office in Boulder, Colorado, on my whiteboard, good ways to do it. And Colin would get an email and talk to Peter Gutmann about this. And so he and Peter Gutmann were working, very closely with each other on these technical discussions, going several messages a day back and forth, all of them encrypted with PGP. And Colin knew exactly what kind of danger I was in. But I couldn't talk to Peter Gutmann, and I certainly couldn't advise Colin to talk to Peter Gutmann, because no matter what, I didn't want to be involved with any kind of obstruction of justice, which would get me in more trouble than I was already in. So I went to Phil Dubois, and I said, look, here's the situation. What do we do? And he said, well, we got to figure out how to get Peter Gutmann to not talk to these customs agents. Let's see, what can we do? Well, he couldn't talk to Colin either. My lawyer couldn't talk to Colin either, because my lawyer was not Colin's lawyer. So what we decided to do was we decided to get Colin his own criminal lawyer, who worked in an office upstairs from Phil Dubois. So we got this guy to volunteer his time. Or I don't know, maybe we might have even paid him, I don't know. No, I think we volunteered his time because it wasn't really going to take that much time. And he volunteered to sit down with Colin. And then my lawyer could talk to Colin's lawyer and explain in great detail, criminal lawyer to criminal lawyer, with all the subtleties and implications that criminal lawyers understand about the consequences of Peter Gutman talking to these interrogators from U.S. Customs. He explained the whole thing to Colin's lawyer. And then Colin came in and talked to Colin's lawyer, and Colin's lawyer explained it to Colin. And then, a couple of days later, I'm sitting on the edge of my seat waiting to see what happens, and an encrypted message comes in from Peter Gutman to Colin. Well, I happen to be in the same room. Now, this is a very, very strange situation because during this whole time I can't talk to Colin. And I really didn't. I didn't tell Colin to tell Peter Gutman this, So we had to go through this incredible circuitous route to get Colin trained up so that so what the idea was that Colin's lawyer would explain to Colin why Colin should not talk to Peter Gutman. Okay? Because certainly Colin shouldn't be involved in obstruction of justice. So that's why Colin needed a criminal lawyer to explain to him why he should not do it. This is just a marvel of design, and I'm like sitting on my hands. I can't type anything onto Peter Gutman, and I can't, you can't talk to Colin at all about this, I mean, Colin and I are having daily discussions about, this disk encryption thing, right? And there's all this subtext going on, and Colin is talking to Peter Gutman through encrypted channels that I can't read, right? And so this is like a couple of days after Colin has been briefed by his own new criminal lawyer on why he should not talk to Peter Gutman. And so finally this message comes back from Peter Gutman, and Colin is at my house. He's at my house, actually. This is funny. He's at my house using my computer to talk to Peter Gutman. And he decrypts this message from Peter Gutman. And my stomach is tied in knots. I mean, I can't sleep, I mean, I'm really kind of a control freak, I really, I get this sort of nervous, Remember, I'm still remembering what all those lawyers said in Washington, that I had no chance, right? And I certainly would have no chance if Peter Gutman spilled everything, because then that would lead them to Hal Finney in Santa Barbara. And then Hal Finney would be, just cut to pieces by the prosecutor, and then he would have to tell him about all the source code that went back and forth across the U.S. border for developing PGP 2.0. So, I mean, that's the way the dots connected to me, because I had full knowledge of my vulnerabilities. And apparently, well, anyway, Peter Gutman finally sent this message to Colin, and Colin decrypted the message. And I saw the message, and it said that he had decided not to speak to them. And this was a very good moment. And so, as far as I know, I don't remember telling that story to anybody else, except maybe privately in one-on-one conversations. So here I am on video, and lots of people will know now how I did not do any obstruction of justice. Because I'm 100% sure that Colin's lawyer told him in no uncertain terms that he should not talk to Peter Gutman about this case, even though he was talking to him every day about the technical discussion that was ongoing. So anyway, so that was the scariest part of the prosecution, other than the absolutely dismal, demoralizing briefing that we got from those 10 lawyers. But that was the most harrowing moment. Waiting for, because they actually had, the U.S. Customs agent was going to fly there to New Zealand. They don't have a guy in New Zealand. They were going to fly him there from some Pacific country, where they have a U.S. Customs office. So it was like, this was like, 48 hours before the interview was supposed to take place that he finally came back and said that he could finally understood that he should not talk to U.S. Customs. So, don't ever get yourself in a situation where you have to worry about making these oblique multi-impact bank shots to get to stay out of prison. It turns out that actually, you know, as I said before, the prosecutor just wasn't interested in the development of PGP 2.0. And so maybe it wouldn't have mattered if he had talked to them. Although if he had, maybe the prosecutor would have become aware of the importance of the development of PGP 2.0. Anyway. So another thing that happened was that you know, the U.S. government has a surprisingly large number of federal agencies that do law enforcement. I mean, you know, everybody knows about the FBI and the DEA and maybe U.S. Customs, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. What else? I don't know. You know, most people don't know about much more than that. But it turns out that just about everybody, and almost all the agencies have some form of law enforcement in their midst. I mean, the U.S. Forest Service has cops. You know, the Department of Agriculture has cops. You know, and so the Internal Revenue Service has cops. In fact, they have cops that investigate IRS agents, you know, who have internal corruption and wrongdoing. So there was a guy who was just such a cop, whose job it was to investigate bad federal agents within the IRS. And he approached me because he thought PGP was really cool, and he wanted me to teach a class for him at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Georgia, where all these federal agents from all these, you know, agencies would go and get trained on how to be cops. And so I agreed to do this. I talked to Phil Dubois, my defense lawyer, about it, and he thought that was a fine idea. And so I agreed to do it. Well, but then I went to, but this was like a few months in the future. But then I went to Europe, and I went to some conference in Europe. And on my way back, I was stopped at Dulles Airport. But some of you might have heard about this incident because it was written about at the time. I was stopped at Dulles Airport by U.S. Customs and taken into an interrogation room without my lawyer. And it was this sort of white, featureless room. It sort of looked like a UFO abduction room, you know. And I said, so what's the problem? You know, you've already searched my luggage. What more do you want? You know, and he said, well, and he takes out this dossier about me that he opens it up, and there's all my case in here, you know. He said, I just want to ask you a few questions about your case, and apparently you were involved in some violation of the Arms Export Control Act, and blah-de-blah-de-blah. He's asking me about what my purpose of my trip overseas, and you know, did I do anything crypto-related over there and all this, and what I didn't know about this and that. And I said, you know, you're not supposed to be asking me questions. I'm represented by legal counsel. And he said, I can do anything I want. This is a port of entry. We control everything here, and you're going to stay here until you answer all of my questions. Well, he's not supposed to do that, you know. and so he started asking me all these pointed questions, and you know, my mouth was dry, let me tell you. And I said, you know, I really do want to see my lawyer. And he said, well, you know, if you're going to take that attitude, then we can just all wait here until you decide what you want to do. And I kind of, I still stood my ground and said I needed to talk to my lawyer. Well, finally, when they finally let me out, when it became apparent that I wasn't going to give up what he wanted, I called my lawyers, my legal defense team, including my lawyer in Washington, since I was in Washington after all. And so that was Ken Bass, who had a lot of experience in this sort of thing and had a real feel for the power politics of the Washington legal scene. And Ken Bass wrote a letter to the Inspector General of U.S. Customs and demanded to know why this incident had occurred, and copied the prosecutor in San Jose, who was my prosecutor, Bill Keene. And the Inspector General's office in U.S. Customs never did reply, but it was an embarrassment to Bill Keene, the prosecutor, because Bill Keene did not tell U.S. Customs to do this. This is something U.S. Customs did on their own. Well, U.S. Customs is really sort of a cowboy law enforcement organization. I mean, they're just one notch short of the BATF, you know, the Waco boys, you know. They pretty much, I mean, they're not, you know, they're not as well behaved as some of the other law enforcement agencies. And so apparently this was something they dreamed up themselves. And so Bill Keene was sort of sensitized to me talking to federal agents without my lawyer present. So when I showed up at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Georgia to talk to a room full of 30 or 40 federal law enforcement agents about training them about PGP and explaining to them how it worked and what to expect if they ever seized a computer with PGP stuff on it, Andy Freed, the guy who invited me, and the guy who ran that school, who had, you know, organized this thing for me to come and speak, had suddenly got a phone call from Bill Keene, the prosecutor, who on that same day had suddenly caught wind. Apparently somebody at FLETC, the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, had made it known to Bill Keene that I was speaking there. And so Bill Keene just kind of panicked. And so he wanted to, so there were two things that happened. One is that he wanted to know if my lawyer knew that I was there. And another is he wanted them to record my lecture. Well, they weren't about to record my lecture. I mean, you know, they didn't think I should be prosecuted to begin with, and it was embarrassing to them to be asked to record my lecture. Now, as far as I was concerned, it would have been perfectly okay to record my lecture because, I mean, a lot of my lectures that were in public were already being recorded, like this one here, and there was usually somebody from the State Department in the audience taking notes and purchasing the audio tape, you know. So I was used to that, and the last thing I'm going to do is make some kind of misstep in front of 30 law enforcement agents. You know, just because there's a microphone in the room, you know, it's making yet one more recording of my lecture wasn't going to bother me that much. But to the guys who had organized this FLETC event, it was a very big deal to them because it would have been to them a violation of my trust. And so they said, well, you know, we're not going to let them speak if we have to record them. And in fact, I did speak, and they did not record me. And I tell you, it was quite an experience because this was the most hostile audience that I faced. But during the break, a couple of the guys came to talk to me privately, and they said to me that they couldn't say this in front of all their colleagues, but they thought that I had done a good thing. And that they were worried about the direction the country was going in as far as the erosion of civil liberties, you know, with advances in surveillance technology, and that they were just worried about that, and they thought that developing PGP was a good thing for civil liberties. It was good to hear that from them. You know, the whole FLETC experience was an interesting experience. But the night before my lecture, I went to this bar, a cop bar. And I mean, you know, this is in a little town where the only thing in that town is FLETC, right? And so I go in this bar with Andy Freed, and in the bar, as far as the eye can see, there's all these patches that are, you know, from the shoulder patches of cops from all around the world. They don't just train federal agents there. They train agents from, like, El Salvador and, you know, other police states, right? And so every interior surface, you know, the ceiling, there was even T-shirts on the ceiling, all the walls, the tabletops, you know, everything, every visible surface. I couldn't tell whether this place was made in wood paneling or you know, drywall or what, because it was all these patches of all these cops. And I, you know, I walked in this bar and it's all cops, you know. I mean, various types of cops, you know. And I asked the bartender, I said, do you ever get robbed in here? You know? Wait a second, I'm getting some beeps here. Oh, that's funny. My PDA is on. I wonder it's beeping at me. Okay. Okay, so that was the Flat C thing. Anyway, you know, my lawyer wanted me to speak at Flat C because we planned to use it at trial. The idea was that if my case went to trial, we wanted to be able to say that, you know, here's Mr. Zimmerman, a fine, upstanding citizen who even takes part of his valuable time to go give free lectures to federal law enforcement agents to teach them about cryptography and help them in their you know, dealing with this kind of technology. And in fact, the prosecutor absolutely didn't want them to be able to say that at trial, so he was trying to discourage that from happening. And if it was going to happen, he wanted a recording of it. And if it was going to happen, he wanted to make sure we didn't have another Dulles incident. So does my lawyer know that I'm there, you know? That was great. So another thing that was going on during all this, you know, you have to realize that while all this was going on, I mean, we're sort of involved in a multi-front war with the feds on this. You see, at the same time that this was going on, there were two civil lawsuits going on that were opening up second and third fronts to the government. One of them was Phil Karn, who was suing the government because he wanted to export a disk containing C source code with crypto on it. That was from the appendix of Bruce Schneier's book, Applied Cryptography. Now, the way that worked was that Phil Karn had okay, at that time, the State Department had control over the rules about exporting strong crypto. And at that time, the State Department had a list of items that they regarded as munitions. And anything that's on this list of munitions, the munitions list, needed a permit from the State Department to be exported. And on the list were things like Stinger missiles and helicopter gunships, thermonuclear weapons, and encryption software. They even had rules that said that there were exceptions where you could export a weapon if it was on a ballistic missile that was being launched at an enemy, you know. Really, they actually had that, you know, which led to some discussions on some chat groups about putting crypto in a capsule and launching it like to Mexico or something, and you know. So anyway, so what you could do is, if you thought that there was some item that you weren't sure whether it was under the jurisdiction of the State Department with these export controls, you could apply for what is known as a commodities jurisdiction, which is a ruling by the State Department that this item is not subject to their jurisdiction, but rather the jurisdiction of the Commerce Department, which doesn't care about export controls on crypto, or at least they didn't then, because at that time it was all in the hands of the State Department. Now, some years later, they passed the control of export controls on crypto exports. They passed it over to the Commerce Department and changed it so that the Commerce Department now was their problem. But that was years later. So when this was going on, when Phil Karn did this very clever thing, it was all in the State Department's hands. Well, Phil Karn did something that the State Department did not. Phil Karn did this incredibly clever attack. He sent in a copy of Bruce Schneier's book, Applied Cryptography. Now, Phil Karn doesn't, at that time, I don't think he'd ever even met Bruce Schneier. I'm sure he has now, of course, but at that time, I don't think he knew Bruce Schneier. And he had bought the book at the local Borders, you know. And so he just had this book, and he wanted to export it. And so he wrapped it up and sent it off to the State Department with a commodities jurisdiction request, asking them to please give him a commodities jurisdiction, a CJ, that would allow him to export this book. Well, at the State Department, they opened this and they read the application, and they looked at this book and they said, why are you wasting our time? This is a book. You know, of course you can export it. You know, why are you bothering to ask us? And he said, well, you know, in the appendix are some C source code for crypto. You know, it's like the source code for DES, you know, and a few other things too. And so I said, sure. What they didn't realize that as soon as they gave a yes to Phil Karn, he had a much more dastardly plan in mind, because he had another commodities jurisdiction application already filled out and waiting to send off. And that one was for a floppy disk containing a byte-for-byte identical copy of the same source code from the appendix of Bruce Schneier's book that they'd already agreed to could be exported. They didn't see that one coming. As soon as they got that one, I can imagine the blood draining from their faces and realizing that they'd been had. And so they realized that they were in trouble. And so they asked the NSA what to do. And the NSA said, don't let them do it. And so they said, okay. So they said no. The reason why I know that they asked the NSA is because years later I applied, I did a FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act request, about all the documents they had about me. And in fact, I had to sue them. It cost me like $30,000 to sue them. But at that time, I had a little more cash, you know. And in those documents, I found that the memos that were going back and forth between the NSA and the State Department about Karn's thing and about my own thing, which I haven't told you about yet. Well, so they said no to Karn, Phil Karn. And so he appealed it through their administrative appeals process. They said no every time through all of his appeals. So finally, Phil Karn sued them in federal court. And now the State Department was a defendant in a civil lawsuit. Well, it was in that context that I went to a Computers, Freedom, and Privacy conference. Gee, it's almost 2 o'clock. 2 o'clock? Yes. How long do I have? 2:30? I'll try to wrap this up quick, and we got to get some questions, right? I usually get questions much earlier on, except I'm really kind of on a roll here, so I want to tell you more about this. So it was in this context that, and I think this was like around 1994. That I went to a Computers, Freedom, and Privacy conference and ran into Bob Pryor, who was an editor at MIT Press. And Bob Pryor wanted to publish a book about PGP. And so he wanted to publish the PGP User's Guide, which is a little bit unusual for a computer manual because it was the only computer manual he'd ever seen that was written in first-person singular. And so I said, sure, but there's something else that I'd like you to do that may be more important. I'd like you to publish the source code to PGP. All of it. Well, at that time, that was only like 800 or 900 pages, which is, I mean, today it would be 10 times that big, but at that time, that's all it was. And he said, well, why? And I said, because I want to be able to export this book, and I want to make it in a nice OCR font that could be scanned in. And he said, okay, that sounds cool. And so he said, sure. So we'll publish 2 books. So I have 2 books published from MIT Press. In fact, they even have similar covers on them, you know. But one of them is called PGP Source Code and Internals. And it really wasn't in a true OCR font. I think it was in like Courier, you know, which is actually fairly easily scanned. But it didn't have any special checksums or CRCs, you know, for error correction. It turns out that that's actually a much more difficult problem than it looks. But the important thing was that I mean, see, I didn't care if it was really scanned in. I mean, this was PGP 262, which is the classic version. It was the last version of PGP that I exclusively controlled. This is before I started a company. And it was the version of PGP that actually never got revised, because during the entire 3-year criminal investigation, that was the last version that came out right at the beginning of that criminal investigation. So PGP 262 was already in Europe. It was already all over the world. So there wasn't much point in publishing a book with the source code in the hopes that it would be scanned. Because in fact, I didn't care if it was going to be scanned, because having it actually scanned was immaterial. The important thing was to try to take advantage of Phil Karn's attack on the State Department by using it as part of my defense strategy if I was indicted. Because it was going to be MIT Press that was going to apply for a CJ for this book. Now, the State Department knew full well the legal context of what a CJ like that was coming in. Remember, they had handled 2 CJs from Phil Karn already. And that second CJ from Phil Karn was something that really alerted them to the Trojan horse that a book could be. And so here they got a CJ request from no less than MIT Press, a prestigious academic press that was beyond any possibility of criminal prosecution. Well, they just sat on it. They didn't say yes, they didn't say no, because they knew that they would be damned if they do and damned if they don't. They couldn't say no because that raised serious First Amendment issues. Here, a prestigious academic press from MIT couldn't sell a book. And they have overseas distributors. I mean, all of MIT's books, MIT Press's books, are distributed, you know, in Europe every time. I mean, you know, it's not some special thing for this. So, in fact, MIT didn't wait for them to reply. They just applied for it and then proceeded to ship the book to Europe, you know. And the State Department knew this. So they didn't know what to do. They asked the NSA what to do, and the NSA said, well, whatever you do, don't say yes. Because they knew what the second CJ would be. If they said yes to this one, I would be sending them a floppy disk. Which again, you know, was really going to be part of my defense strategy. The whole thing was to keep me out of prison. We wanted to present this at trial as part of my defense, as, you know, to try to blow a hole in the theory of prosecution. Anyway, and nobody ever actually scanned it in because it was, as I said, it was already in Europe. But it was all the source code. It was all the source code. It even had the make files in it. So anyway, years later, after they dropped the case against me, I remember talking to a State Department guy who said that it was tremendously satisfying to them that they had managed to get through the whole process and without ever having to reply to that CJ request. In fact, that they had passed it off to the Commerce Department when they changed the rules, saying the Commerce Department was responsible for it. But years later, when I started PGP Inc., we once again published the source code to PGP. But this time, we did it for an entirely different purpose. This time, we did it for the express purpose to get it actually scanned in Europe. Because this time, we actually had a release strategy that involved not allowing any machine-readable source code to leave the building. This time, we made sure that no PGP source code ever left our engineering lab in electronic form. The only form it left it in was printed in a book. Actually, no, it did leave it in electronic form when I took it down to Kinko's to print it out on their PostScript printer. And it was 5,000 pages of source code, PGP version 5. And we brought it to, there were three things that you could do. You see, there was an exception in the export controls that said that if you publish it in a book, if you publish source code in a book, it was not subject to the export controls. And the 3 criteria were that it had to be available in a bookstore, that it had to be available in a public library, and that it had to be given out at a public conference. Now, it's actually any one of these. It wasn't all three ANDed together. It was all three ORed together. So we took the AND approach. We actually took it to a bookstore, Printers, Inc. in Palo Alto, and made it available there. In fact, we didn't even charge the bookstore. We said, here, free. Here, take these books for free. You can sell them for whatever price you want, you know. But we said, but actually, there's 2 copies we want you to sell for free to these 2 guys in Europe who were waiting with their scanners ready. And we put it in a public library, and we gave it away at a public conference. But there were no public conferences coming up. There was no crypto conferences. So we asked our lawyer about this, and he said, well, it really doesn't matter what kind of public conference it is. It could be a conference of shoe salesmen, It doesn't have to be crypto, just a public conference. Gee, any public well, what is a public conference? Well, if public, where members of the public are invited, and they, it's open, and you pass it out. We thought, what could fit that? How about the monthly cypherpunks meeting? Well, okay, during the 1990s, there was this sort of libertarian group called the cypherpunks, which I don't know. They're not really. I don't know. I don't know what they're doing these days, but they were quite an active group in the 1990s, and they were sort of anarchists and libertarians, and they really believed in the cause of crypto getting released from the bonds of these export controls and other domestic controls, and so this seemed to be a good venue. So we did. In fact, we even invited them to have the meeting in our building, which, by the way, our building happened to be a bank building. And so they all came into our building on one evening, and we had these boxes. It's 5,000 pages, right? So it's a whole box for each book. I mean, it's actually, we had multiple volumes, the Windows version, the Mac version, the crypto libraries, And so we had these boxes here, and we're passing them out for free at this public conference. And we want everybody to remember that this happened. This is like, if we ever got in trouble for it, this was going to be like a major event that happened that would be part of the evidence at trial, In fact, that would be a disincentive to prosecute us, the mere existence of such a meeting, So we had it in a bookstore, we had it in a library, and we were giving it away at a public conference. And we wanted this to be a very well-known event where everybody would take notes and know what happened and remember that it happened. And so it was something did happen, though, that was not something that I wanted to happen. And that is, remember, this is a meeting of the cypherpunks, and it involves other things on the agenda besides passing out our source code. It turns out that one of the guys there wanted to announce, make some announcement for some cypherpunks-related activity. He got up and he said, he got up and had this bag with him, and he set it down, and he said, I just wanted to announce that the Cypherpunks Gun Club is going shooting next Saturday, and you're all invited to come along. And he unzips the bag, and he takes out an AR-15 assault rifle. With an ammo clip on it, And I'm really, remember, for 3 years I went through this thing where I wore a suit every day, so that, for the TV cameras and for the press, so that I could be seen as respectable in the court of public opinion, I mean, my instincts were all honed toward this sort of middle-of-the-road, respectable, something that would be appealing to the broad middle class of America, the political middle, that would be so important in persuading them not to prosecute me. And so when this guy gets up with this, it's an assault rifle. We're not talking about a hunting shotgun like what John Kerry had like a few days ago. And I'm thinking, couldn't he have waited till like next month to do this? Fortunately, it never became necessary to use the events of that meeting in any kind of defense effort. Because we had the other things going on too. But it turns out that they did scan it in Europe. It took them 1,000 man-hours to correct all the errors. 1,000 man-hours. Why? Because it turns out that OCR scanning is really designed for natural language, like English or French. Because, you know, there's errors you get from OCR. And those errors are resolved. It creates ambiguities, but you can resolve the ambiguities with spelling dictionaries. And spelling dictionaries work well for English, but not so well for C source code. I mean, it doesn't know what to do with */, for example. In fact, what it usually does with */, it assumes it's some dirt on the glass and just deletes it. Imagine what that does, right? So it turns out that it just had enormous numbers of errors, and it took 1,000 man-hours, which the Europeans did, by the way. I mean, they really felt it was important. And finally, PGP came out in Europe several months after its release in the US. The source code finally came out on CD-ROM in Europe. We realized we had to do a better job next time. So we got detailed reports from the guys in Europe who were scanning it, guys who were personal friends of mine. And I mean, not their big volunteer armies that helped them do it, but we got their detailed reports on exactly what kind of problems they had. And so the next version, we developed a much more sophisticated system of printing the source code. We had checksums on every line, CRCs. We had 16 bits of CRC on every line, plus another 8 bits of CRC that was really a running CRC32 polynomial that would accumulate down the page. And you put 1 byte on each line, so that if you got an error here, even if by some miracle it didn't show up on this line, it would be on the next line, or certainly by the next line, you know. And so we had, and then plus we had a CRC32 at the bottom of the page, and an MD5 at the end of every file. So, and then we developed a special font that had special modifications to resolve the ambiguities. We also came up with a special Radix 64 character set that could be scanned for scanning in things that weren't C source code. Things like icons, sound clips, animation. You know, remember, this is a Windows Macintosh application with all kinds of GUI stuff. And we did all that, and we sent it to them again. It was like 6,500 lines of source code. And it took 30 hours to fix it all. From 1,000 hours to 30 hours. And it was a bigger body of source code. And so I remember talking to some guys from NSA. You know, NSA, actually, they send the guys to the same conferences I go to. And they said, you know, we just assumed that you cheated the second time around and just leaked out the source code. And I said, no, 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 no. We went through a lot of trouble to make sure it went smoothly this time. And so we had actually developed, in fact, I had a separate book. We had a whole body of tools that were optimized tools for fixing the problems of OCR scanning of C source code. In fact, I had a book that I published called Tools for Publishing Source Code via OCR. And the interesting thing was that this book was self-bootstrapping. You know, first there's a few pages of introductory explanation of how to tune the OCR tools, and then there's the first page is a Perl script, which you scan in, and probably wouldn't have that many errors, you know, and it would be smart enough to scan in the second page to correct the output of the OCR scanner for the second page. And then that was a much denser Perl script that was smart enough to scan in a whole bunch of pages that followed, which had the body of the tools, which was like 30 pages of tools. And then those 30 pages of tools were smart enough to scan in the 6,000 pages of PGP source code. It was a self-bootstrapping process. And it blew a hole a mile wide in the US export control regime for cryptographic source code. It became possible then to turn it into this high-volume pipeline of shipping out unlimited quantities of strong crypto in source code form to Europe. And it played an important role in finally tearing down the export controls, which happened finally in 2000. Well, anyway, all right, so I kind of run over on that. This is the longest I put off questions for a long time. So let's open it up for questions. Yeah? Oh, the PGP trust model. Well, I wanted to reflect human society. You see, a lot of times the designs of things sort of reflect the institutions that give birth to them. I mean, that's why Apple computers look like what they look like, and Microsoft Windows looks like the way it looks like, and why IBM's old operating system OS 360 looked like the way it looked like. The trust models that existed before PGP were very centralized, and in PEM, for example, I mentioned PEM, Privacy Enhanced Mail. It used a centralized trust model because it was all set up to give revenue to RSA, and so everybody had to get their keys signed by one. The I at the top of the pyramid. In God we trust, in Bidzos we trust. And it was a centralized trust model. And the people that were working on PEM, I think Steve Kent, for example, was an advocate of this centralized approach. All the messages had to be signed. You couldn't send an unsigned message in PEM. Well, I didn't really like that because I don't like the idea of every little casual note that I write to become a sworn affidavit that could be used against me in a court of law. Maybe it's because I think like a criminal defendant. And so, having accountability for every casual human whim seemed to be not a good fit for, human behavior. I was much more in favor of a kind of an organic, bottom-up rather than top-down approach. And I think that if you look at the most complex systems in the universe, biological systems, they're all bottom-up. And that's my natural design instincts, is bottom-up, to try to get a high-level complexity emerging from low-level rules. These are lessons that you can get from looking at artificial life, from I don't know if you guys have looked at artificial life, like from the Santa Fe Institute has held some conferences some years ago on artificial life, but they all involve this sort of bottom-up approach. The PGP trust model is kind of an organic reliance on natural human behavior at the low level. I think I heard about some university that when they first built the campus, they didn't build any sidewalks. They just had grass in between all the buildings. And then in the first semester, they just let everybody walk wherever they wanted to walk. And then they watched where was the grass worn out, and then they poured concrete there and made sidewalks. See, that's the way I like to do things. Yeah. Well, tomorrow I'm going to be talking about human rights issues, civil liberties, the impacts of surveillance technology on human rights, on the erosion of privacy, that Moore's law is probably the most, presents the most difficulty for privacy in the information age. I mean, it does present certain solutions to us, too, partial solutions, but Moore's law, if you have surveillance technology, which is proliferating tremendously. If you have computers behind those cameras doing face recognition and doing other kinds of pattern recognition, transaction analysis, and the fusion of data from different surveillance technologies, and fusion and synthesis of the data by machines that are under the influence of Moore's law, you have an extremely powerful force that erodes privacy. That's going to be, and there's a lot of material to cover to explain how that works. That's what I'm going to be talking about tomorrow. Well, you can't really solve it all with cryptography. There has to be public policy components. Yeah.
Just wondering, when you decided to use RSA as part of PGP, how did you feel that they might react? Obviously, you didn't quite expect what they brought down.
Well, that's an interesting question. In fact, that kind of gets to the question of the decision of how to develop PGP to begin with. Because, in fact, in 1991, or in 1990 when I started on it in earnest, the whole situation was highly constrained. The RSA patents, which existed only in the United States, was locking down the availability of public key algorithms in the United States, of public key implementations in the United States. And the export controls were preventing it from being exported to the rest of the world. So, they got you coming and going. It was extremely constrained. And so I felt that that no one was going to do something to try to break through that dual barrier. It was a layered defense system, and it took different approaches to break through it. But I thought, well, one approach that might break through it would be free software. I mean, I did want to try to find a way to make money from it, but I abandoned the plans to make money for it when Senate Bill 266 came out about 3 months into the development of PGP in the spring of 1991. And it said that companies that develop communications technology should put backdoors in for law enforcement. This was a sense of Congress resolution. Now, it was defeated later, but when it was introduced, I thought this was a kind of a warning of the shape of things to come. In fact, later on, things got much worse than that. So if I look at the kinds of constraints that were in place to prevent this technology from becoming available to the public on a large scale, the export controls and the patents, it was so constrained that nobody was ever going to be able to break through that. And so that was largely the reason why I decided that the only way to zigzag through that obstacle course was to have kind of free guerrilla software. It would be immune, largely immune, I thought, to both of them. Turns out that it wasn't that immune, but that's the nature of that's the fog of war. I think I can't remember who it was, Sun Tzu or some Chinese war student said that no battle plan has ever survived first contact with the enemy. So that was certainly an example there. It's hard to plan for that. Yeah.
Touching on that issue, the developers of the new privacy product, do you see them as sort of allies in the policy or competitors?
Well, no. I'm glad that there is a GNU privacy guard. I've said that. I said that to Werner Koch many times, who's the guy who did that. In fact, I tell you, during the dark days when PGP was on its way down into the dark abyss of intellectual property black hole that Network Associates had when it was under the control of Network Associates, I was very glad that there was a GNU privacy guard, because maybe that would be the only thing that would survive. It turned out not to be true, because later on a new company was formed to buy the intellectual property from Network Associates and rescue it. And now, today, it's now in the hands of a company that truly believes in the ideals of PGP. PGP.com is back. There was dancing in the streets when that happened. So I don't look at GNU Privacy Guard now as the lifeboat of the PGP standard, as I did when it was on its way, when PGP was in the throes of going down with Network Associates. But I'm still glad that it exists. And, we always wanted there to be more than one vendor, because it's too important to leave in the hands of a single company. Yeah. By the way, having said that, I'd like to say that I think PGP is better. Well, remember, there were two rationales for that. The first one was as a strategy in my defense, in my criminal defense effort. In that case, there was a specific reason why we did it: to bring it out at trial, to bring out the government's response to it at trial. If it came to that. But then later on, when there was no criminal investigation going on anymore, we had a different strategy. And certainly we didn't want to repeat the mistakes I'd made before, where we didn't want to start a new criminal investigation. So we had to make sure that in an overabundance of caution, we just made sure that no source code left our building in electronic form. Well, the only other form it could leave it in is paper, which was the only legal form it could be exported from the U.S. So that was the rationale for doing those two different rationales for publishing source code at different times. Which is why the second one was far more engineered for real scanning. The first one was never intended to be really scanned. It was just a demonstration to put them on the spot. Yeah. The question is, what about moving the company outside the U.S.? Well, now there are no export controls. Now there's no reason to do such a thing. No, I didn't really think that that was a good thing to do. I mean, for one thing, when I was under threat of prosecution, I couldn't move it outside because part of the law also included me working with other people outside the U.S. It was illegal for me to help other people outside the U.S. develop strong crypto products. So if I moved to Europe, it wouldn't help. It would make it even worse. The U.S. has this peculiar idea of extraterritoriality. We see a lot of examples of it. It's not just in crypto. Yeah. The Transparent Society. I know I've heard of the Transparent Society. I'm just drawing a blank right now. Yeah. Oh, God, no. Yeah, I don't buy that. Transparent Society, where everybody can spy on everybody else? No. No, that doesn't help. I mean, I do think it's good that we know what the government is doing. But that doesn't mean that knowing what the government is doing makes it any easier on me if they know what I'm doing. I mean, everybody has secrets to protect. We can't say that. It's not like money or something where if I lose money and you lose the same amount, or I mean, you could lose. You could still lose. It doesn't help if the other guy loses too. You still lose. You lose your privacy. It's no consolation that the government is also losing their privacy. Now, of course, there's lots of things in the government that I'd like to see brought open into the sunshine, Lots of corrupt, slimy decisions that get made, right? Lots of corrupt, disgusting, slimy decisions that get made. Let me see if I can embellish that a little bit more, But, actually, I think there are some other things in government that I'd rather that they keep secret. I mean, maybe, maybe there's like military strategy or something like that. I'd like to know that if they're going to drop some special forces guys in by parachute at night in Afghanistan, that it not be in the New York Times the day before the strike, and it'll have everybody read exactly where they should shoot to kill the Americans. There's lots of things that the government should keep a secret. And I don't see that we gain by having everybody lose their privacy. Humans can be embarrassed by the loss of privacy. Yeah.
So that being said, do you believe that people of the government are always better at determining or striking the balance between safety and privacy, or are some things just better left to the government?
Well, I don't really trust the government's instincts on what that balance should be. Whenever I hear the words balancing privacy and security, the hair always stands up on the back of my neck. I always feel like, during the debates of the 1990s on crypto policy, that buzzword, that buzz phrase often reared its ugly head, Because usually it's kind of like that expression, with all due respect. If you hear somebody say with all due respect, it means they're about to insult you, Whenever you hear that phrase, seeking a balance between privacy and security, that always means that what they're about to say is that it's, there's not going to be any privacy. I was willing to sort of give the government a little slack in not criticizing them publicly too much after 9/11. But the Patriot Act and the abuses of it have taught me that the government is opportunistically using the Patriot Act to invade privacy in all kinds of areas that are unrelated to terrorism. I sit on I sit on a board of people that makes recommendations to the government about scientific communications and national security, because the government has too many controls on foreign scientists visiting the United States to attend a conference, and they can't get visas, and it's creating a huge problem. And so there's a group of people that are trying to recommend policy changes to lighten up on that, and I'm on this commission, this roundtable, to do that. And one of those meetings had somebody from the Justice Department come and give a talk. The guy who gave a talk was a guy named Viet Dinh. Well, Viet Dinh is the author of the Patriot Act. And he explained that, well, I raised an objection during his presentation that the Patriot Act is being abused, that we all kind of made a deal with the government as a society that we would allow the Patriot Act because we were all upset about 9/11, and that we would be more amenable to allowing, these freedoms to be undermined. That to the extent that we're giving our consent to it, that's why, because of 9/11. And in light of that, I raised the objection that it was not in the public interest for the Justice Department to be teaching seminars to their prosecutors, which they are, of teaching their prosecutors how to use the Patriot Act to prosecute all manner of crime. Not just terrorists, not just Al-Qaeda, but just all kinds of crimes, just common crimes. And his response to that was that, well, crime is crime, and that's the Patriot Act was a law that was a useful tool for that. And I said, well, what about the social contract that you had with us, that we let you have this Patriot Act to protect us from Al-Qaeda, and now you're using it for all kinds of opportunistic things to make your job easier in prosecuting everybody that you want to prosecute. And he said, well, you have to understand that the Patriot Act was really not a deal that we made because of 9/11. It was something that we wanted to have for years, but we never had the chance to do it until 9/11. 9/11 presented us with the political opportunity to introduce the Patriot Act and have it become law. Now, I'm paraphrasing. That's not exactly how he said it, okay? But that's the gist of what he was saying. And I got pretty upset when I heard him say that. Of course, I already knew that was true, but he was admitting it. And so that's when I knew that it was a mistake to cut these guys some slack. And in fact, I'd been sort of wanting for some years to work on a new project that would probably piss off the government again. But I'd been sort of putting it off, first because the internet bubble burst and couldn't raise the money to do it, and then later because of 9/11, I figured I'd just work on some other things and make some money in other ways and just wait a couple more years and then do it later, But after listening to this guy, Viet Dinh, give this explanation of why the Patriot Act was passed and what its real purpose was, I decided that maybe I should move up my plans. So I'm going to do something. I hope I don't get in trouble again. Try to be careful this time. Yeah.
Would you get in trouble again, given the current political climate? How do you think it would different?
Well, I'll probably talk to some more lawyers before I do anything. I'll be a lot more careful this time. But you know, I'm a cryptographer, or I'm an applied cryptographer. I'm not a real mathematical cryptologist, and so I try to do what I know how to do. So I hope I can do this. Anything else? How much time do we have? Minus 5 minutes. I guess that kind of squelches things. Okay. Well, all right. Now, I really like these microphones because, did you ever see that one of the Naked Gun movies where the guy gives a talk and then he goes off to the men's room and there's all these sounds coming out the loudspeakers, you know?
I can take that from you if you need to use the restroom. Thanks. Yeah, that works well. Thank you all for coming. This has been a cool, wonderful conference. I personally believe, but I'm obviously biased. Hope you all can come back next year. We'll certainly let you all know when dates are announced, and we have a list of speakers and that sort of thing. The next event is the MechMania Final Showdown, if you'd like to stick around and watch it and see the results of the 24 hours of coding. But other than that, have a good time.
Hey, there's something I really need help in. I need volunteers who will help me with Unix administration. I have this FreeBSD box at home that I have all my servers on, and I don't know how to fix a lot of things that come up, and and I need some Unix weenies to help me with this. You know, just once in a while I have some questions that come up and I need help on. So if anybody wants to talk to me after this, I could use some cheap volunteer labor. It's not a lot of stuff, you know, but that's it. Thanks.
No problem.